From the high and god-haunted altitude of the prime speaker's dais, the great hall did not echo with the pulse of a living empire. It rattled with the dry breath of a mausoleum. This cavern was a hollowed-out skull of a civilization, a staggering vault of obsidian and gold where the founding races stood in frozen, unblinking judgment of the meat below. Below the dome, pale mist swirled, a climate of manufactured ghosts drifting through rafters that had forgotten the sun. The crystalline seats, designed to throb with the bioluminescent heat of their occupants, were extinguished, a sprawling sea of matte gray ash. Where once 1,000 pheromones had fought for dominance in a rich, chaotic perfume of power, there was now only the sterile, recycled scent of failing oxygen scrubbers. The delegates who remained were pathetic husks, their sleeves draped in heavy silks, their minds lost in the flickering neon of private data streams. Yet, at the center of this rot stood Ambassador Robert Harland. He was a speck of carbon against the chrome, a brief candle in a vast and indifferent dark. But he possessed a stillness that felt like a coiled spring, a silence of the soul so absolute it made my skins itch with the sudden, metallic tang of impending violence. I reached for the gavel, a weight of stone that felt as heavy as a planet's core. I struck it once, the sound a singular, jagged fracture in the silence. The emergency session will find its order, I declared, my voice a hollow reed vibrating in the mist. I acknowledge the inconvenience of this summons, the friction it causes against your heavy schedules and the petty metrics of your own worlds. I surveyed that graveyard of grey seats, the hypocrisy bitter as bile in my throat. Yet the gravity of the meat demands our presence. I recognize Ambassador Harland of Earth. He comes not with data packets or the soft lies of light-show diplomacy, but by a singular, blood-stained petition. The floor is his. Let us see what the small man brings to the high house. Harland did not move to the consoles. He did not seek the digital grace of holographic maps or tactical diagrams to shield his intent. He stood as a man stands before the final sleeve death, or as a god stands before the condemned. 6 hours ago, he began, and the words fell like spent casings on a concrete floor, New Haven was silenced. He let the words silenced hang like a shroud. It was no fortress, no chrome-plated garrison. It was a settlement of 50,000 pioneers, flesh and blood who had crossed the black to root themselves in the dirt. They were the first wave of a dream, now a wet smear in the dark. He paused, his gaze a cold, sharpening blade sweeping across the board, flickering masks of the room. The Grolak Empire did not skirmish for borders. They sterilized the world from the high orbit, turning a living garden into a scorched cinder. 50,000 lives, the laughter of children, the sweat of the labor, the very hope of the breed, extinguished in a single, mechanical stroke of genocide. We have the sensor logs that scream their final frequencies. We have the energy signatures signed in Grolak fire. This was no error of navigation. I demand justice. I demand that this council proves it is more than a committee of vultures presiding over the commerce of corpses. A silence followed his words, a suffocating vacuum that pressed against the chest like the weight of deep-sea trenches. My primary eyes blinked in a slow, rhythmic stutter as my mind struggled to map the sheer, jagged topography of his claim. Sterilization? The word felt like a virus in the blood. From orbit? A level of clinical, automated butchery that our progressive galaxy had supposedly outgrown. I peered down at Harland, searching for the telltale twitch of the political actor, the flicker of the digital shill, but his face was a death mask of unweathered stone. I cleared my throat, the sound a dry rattle in the tomb. These are world-shaking charges, Ambassador, a feast of horrors, I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle against the cold. I turned my gaze toward the Grolak delegation, where the shadows pooled like spilled oil. I call upon Ambassador Varka to answer for this butcher's bill. Varka did not rise with the haste of the accused. He took a long, obscene moment to adjust the interlocking plates of his ceremonial armor, dark, polished alloy that ground together with a sound like teeth on bone. He savored the stillness, he drank the anticipation like a vintage of fresh blood. When he finally stood, he did not deign to acknowledge the man who had named him. He did not look at Harland. Instead, he turned his predatory optics toward me and the vast, hollow sea of gray. Allegations? Let us dispense with the soft-skinned language of the nursery. Let us call them observations. Varka roared, his voice a thick, gravelly vibration that filled the hall with the stench of arrogance. The Grolak Empire does not hide in the grime. We found a primitive rot, a biological infestation, on a corridor of high security. That colony was a screeching military provocation, a forward base wearing the pathetic skin of farms and silos. We acted with the decisiveness our blood demands. If 50,000 farmers were scoured in the cleansing, the sin lies with Earth. They used their own kind as meat shields for their crude ambitions. We owe no apologies for the purge. We owe no apologies for being Grolak. At the podium, the physical toll of Varka's bile manifested in the very marrow of the man. Harlan's knuckles were not merely pale, they were bone-white, a stark and bloodless contrast against the dark, polished edge of the console he gripped as if it were the only anchor in a world turned to vacuum. For the first time in our long, measured acquaintance, the mask slipped. I heard the sudden, jagged fracture of a raw humanity, a tremor born of grief, a vibration of pure, unadulterated pain that cracked the smooth casing of his voice. It was a brief, bleeding wound of sound, instantly cauterized by a rising tide of terrifyingly cold intensity. Provocation. Harland whispered, the word carrying more mass than Varka's roar. Then, he spoke for the ghosts. They were families, Varka. They were mothers who sang to their young while the radiation sirens wailed. They were fathers who labored in the red dust until their sleeves were spent. They were just farmers, meat and hope, who asked nothing of this hollow galaxy but the dirt beneath their boots. They hadn't even finished the construction of the primary school, a place for children to learn of the stars, when your fleet arrived to turn their curriculum into radioactive ash.
From across the aisle, where the shadows of the VRI delegation shimmered with a greasy, iridescent film, Ambassador Glaucus leaned forward. His skin was moist and translucent, glistening under the amber lights like a fresh surgical wound. He let out a wet, rhythmic clicking, a sound that served as a chuckle in the damp, dark architectures of his home world. If that were truly the case, if these families were as innocent as the propaganda suggests, Ambassador Harland, Glaucus hissed, his tone a cloying, synthetic sympathy that made my stomach churn with a sudden, sharp nausea. Then I fear the fault is found in the human ledger. One cannot blame the Grolak for their vigilance when Earth's bureaucracy is so porous. It is a tragedy of the sleeve, really. One cannot expect a warrior caste to distinguish a humble wheat silo from a strategic missile battery when the digital designations are so lamentably fragged. In that moment, I felt it, a cold, hard knot of genuine, physical horror that tightened in the center of my chest, cutting off my breath. I looked across the vast, shadowed chamber, searching for a single spark of indignation, a single flash of righteous fire, but I saw only the truth written in the casual, predatory slumps of the delegates. They did not care. To the entities gathered in this skull hall, 50,000 human lives were not a tragedy. They were a rounding error, a minor administrative friction to be smoothed over for the sake of mineral rights and the preservation of the status quo. Varka sat with the smug, armored confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. Glaucus smiled with the safety of a scavenger protected by the very laws he mocked. And I, the prime speaker, realized with a sickening clarity that I was merely the head clerk of a charnel house. I had no grand armada to launch, no sanctions that would not be vetoed by the very monsters sitting before me. I looked at Harland, seeing the desperate, holy fire in his eyes, a fire that should have ignited the stars, and I felt smaller than the grime beneath his nails. I could not meet his gaze. I lowered my eyes to the cold obsidian of my desk and whispered, "I am sorry, Ambassador Harland." Then, finding the hollow, brittle strength to address the hall, I spoke the death warrant of justice. In the absence of a majority consensus for intervention, the motion for retaliation is denied. Harland did not explode into the expected human rage. He did not scream at the rafters or plead with the statues of the founders. He did not even offer a final, desperate argument. He simply stood and surveyed the room, his eyes moving with a slow, mechanical precision as he recorded the dead, heavy silence and the mocking, toothy smirks of the predators. And then, as his gaze finally met mine, the transition was absolute. A shutter closing over a window, a soul retreating into an armored bunker. The diplomat I had known, the tireless bridge builder, the man of soft words and compromise, was gone, vaporized. In his place was something primordial, something that predated the council, the law, and the stars. He gathered his notes with hands that were now perfectly, terrifyingly still. Without a word, without the customary bow, he turned and strode out of the assembly. His walk was no longer a politician's swagger. It was a thing of precise, lethal efficiency, the rhythmic, purposeful tread of a man who had stopped looking for a hand to shake and started looking for a throat to cut. As he passed the Grolak delegation, Varka called out with a braying laugh, "That's right, little mammal. Go home. Go have a temper tantrum in the mud." Harland did not break stride. He did not look back. After the doors hissed shut, the assembly returned to its petty metrics, debating orbital fees as if the universe had not just shifted on its axis. When the next official session convened, the human seats were a void. For the first time in 5 cycles, the Terran crystalline chairs remained dim and gray, reflecting only the stagnant mists above. Usually, Harland was the first to arrive, his presence a source of heat in the cold hall, sharing gifts of earth chocolate and attempting with a stubborn, charming persistence to learn the discordant greetings of the outer rim. Today, there was only the emptiness. I delayed the gavel for 10 minutes, my eyes darting toward the main entrance, hoping to see his easy, human smile break the gloom. But the black doors remained shut. The rest of the council did not seem to notice the missing limb. They simply carried on, grinding through the dry technicalities of trade as if a vital organ had not just been ripped from the heart of our community. The silence from the human quarter was not a peace. It was the quiet of a fuse burning toward the powder. Driven by a gnawing anxiety that pulsed like a low-frequency hum in my chest, I attempted to breach the silence via the holophone. I expected Maya, the receptionist whose voice usually carried the warmth of an organic sun, a woman who sold the human brand of diplomacy with light-hearted jokes and a smile that felt like a gift. Instead, I was met by a clinical, synthesized grating that felt like it had been scraped from the hull of a deep space freighter. "State your identity and the metric of your inquiry," it clipped, the syllables devoid of any biological cadence. I projected a speaker's authority I did not feel. "This is Prime Speaker Jarl. I wish to speak with Ambassador Harland." There followed a silence so vast it felt like the distance between galaxies. When the voice returned, it was a razor of ice. "The human embassy is closed to all non-human entities. Your frequency is no longer recognized." The line did not merely end. It died with a final, mechanical snap that echoed in my skull. To be dismissed so curtly, after cycles of being the human's most pampered confidant, felt like a backhand across the mouth. It was a deliberate, surgical rudeness that carried the weight of a death sentence. I sought the embassy in the flesh, only to find the perimeter transformed into a choke point. It was lined with armed guards, a display of primitive force the humans had once mocked as the insecurity of lesser races. As I approached, 2 sentries stepped into my path with a synchronization that was purely, terrifyingly machine-like. "The embassy is closed to the meet, sir," one said, his eyes hidden behind a polarized visor, his face an unreadable slab of indifference. I felt my pride flare, a pathetic spark in a rising tide of dread. "I am Prime Speaker Jarl. I demand entry." They did not acknowledge the title or the history. "The embassy is closed to non-humans." I tried to force my way past, to assert the physical gravity of my office, but a guard extended a single, open hand. It was like walking into a reinforced bulkhead. I stumbled back, my breath caught in a throat that felt like it was closing. I had not known that creatures as soft-looking as humans could possess such raw, immovable, and terrifying density. Defeated, I retreated to a small sanctuary around the corner, an Earth coffee shop called Ground Control. It was a place of rich, dark smells and vibrant noise, but now it was a hollow socket. The windows were dark, and a stark white notice was taped to the reinforced glass, "Permanently closed." The word permanently vibrated with the finality of a terminal diagnosis. No moving, no under new management. Just the end. I stood there, the silence of the street feeling like a heavy, leaden shroud. I remembered the baristas, young, bright-eyed humans who knew the specific bitter chemistry of my favorite brew. I thought of the regulars, the Vree, the Talaxians, who had found a common ground in this fragrant corner of Earth. That bridge was gone, burned at both ends. The warmth of ground control wasn't just an establishment that had shuttered. It was a dying ember, a final warning that the heat was leaving the galaxy for good. Within days, the silence was shattered by a chorus of frantic transmissions. The humans were not merely resigning. They were amputating themselves from the galactic body. I received a high-priority scream from the minds of Altair 4. Their entire technical team had walked off the job mid-shift, leaving the massive excavators idling in the dark like abandoned behemoths. The Vree library sent a stinging complaint. The human archivists had purged their workstations, erased cycles of cross-reference data, and vanished into the night. Even the core shipyards reported a crisis. Their engine tuners, the grease monkeys who could coax miracles out of a failing warp core, were gone. It was a systemic withdrawal, a cold infection of absence spreading across every sector. The humans were the grease in the gears, and without them, the machinery of the universe began to grind, smoke, and scream. I pulled the emergency census logs, my fingers trembling as the data pulsed in a harsh, arterial red. Before New Haven, there were 1 billion humans woven into the chrome and grime of our world. Now, the total figure was 32,000. Just 32,000 left in the entire reach of Council space. Where had the billion gone? How had they slipped through the cracks of our surveillance so completely? They were vanishing into the great void, leaving behind empty hab modules and the cold dust of abandoned dreams. I tried the embassy one last time. No recording this time, just a human voice, carved from the heart of a glacier. Earth is not communicating with the alien, Prime Speaker. Thank you for the history. She hung up. In that moment of total rejection, I realized we hadn't just lost a friend. We were being surgically, precisely erased from their ledger. I stood as a silent, paralyzed witness to the final spasms of the human exodus. I could do nothing but gaze with a sickening admiration at the sheer, terrifying speed of the receding tide. It was not a flight of refugees, but a grand, synchronized amputation. The coordination was staggering, a feat of collective will that defied every metric we had used to measure them. They packed their lives into efficient crates, settled their ledgers with a cold, mathematical precision, and vanished into the night. They moved with the silent, heavy purpose of the ocean drawing back before a tsunami, leaving the rest of us to gasp in the thinning air. While the shadows of the capital grew long and jagged, I found myself outside the human embassy. The grand doors, once symbols of an open hand, had been unceremoniously ripped from their hinges and propped against a sleek, black transport. Robert Harland stood there, his hands encased in heavy work gloves, locking the final seals on a shipment of ghosts. I stopped, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. Ambassador Harland. I called across the pavement. He turned, but the movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the warmth I had once mistaken for weakness. He did not smile. He looked through me as if searching for a ghost he no longer expected to find. An aide whispered something about waiting in the car, and Harland nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. Robert, what in the name of the founders is this? I pleaded. He did not waste breath on a reply. He simply pointed a gloved finger at a notice fixed to the brick. The human embassy is closed. No promise of reopening, no refer inquiries to Earth. Just a door slammed in the face of history. You will not see me again, he said, his voice flat and final as a shovel on a grave. But I can tell you one thing, Speaker. You are going to fragging hate my replacement. I reached out, desperate for the man I knew, and gripped his arm. The sensation was a shock. It was like holding a cold, unyielding steel pipe. He looked at my hand, then at my eyes, and the temperature of the street seemed to drop into the negatives. I am not friends, he said, each word a hammer blow to my chest, with anyone who condones the butchery of 50,000 civilians. Now, let go of my arm. I recoiled, scorched by the ice in his voice. He entered the transport, the seal hissing shut like a final breath, and drove away into the gathering dark. The frantic complaints about vanishing humans eventually slowed, then tapered off into a heavy, suffocating silence. It was not the restful hush of a garden at night. It was the quiet of a fuse that had reached the powder. It was the electric, pressurized stillness that precedes the breaking of a world-ending storm, and in that silence, we finally began to hear the sound of our own foundations cracking. In the agonizing weeks that followed, the Council attempted to find solace in the familiar rhythms of the bureaucracy, but the machinery of our civilization began to grind, spark, and smoke. We discovered, far too late and with a terrifying clarity, that the humans had been the grease in the gears of the universe. Massive trade convoys were delayed for months as non-human crews struggled to navigate the complex, intuitive logistics the humans used to handle with a casual smile. Power grids flickered and died in the outer sectors because no one else quite understood the jury-rigged fixes, the brilliant, unorthodox engineering solutions the human technicians had implemented with duct tape and genius. We were learning to live without them, but it was a cold, joyless labor. The effort of breathing was becoming a chore, and the silence from Earth remained absolute, a heavy weight on the galactic soul. Days bled into weeks, and weeks stretched into months. We grew accustomed to the harder, thinner way of life, convincing ourselves that we had survived the transition. We told ourselves the human withdrawal was merely the tantrum of a sensitive race, and that the stars would continue to turn regardless of their absence. We believed that the galaxy belonged to the patient, to the cold, and to the bureaucratic. We were wrong. On a day that began with the same mundane, gray mists as any other, the fragile casing of our ignorance was shattered by a scream that bypassed every bureaucratic filter. I was summoned with such frantic urgency that I rushed into the great hall, still fumbling with the heavy silver buttons of my robes, my heart thundering against my ribs like a trapped engine. The chamber, once a hollow tomb, was now a roiling sea of meat and panic, packed to the rafters with delegates whose faces were etched with a terror I had never witnessed. Even Varka, the iron-plated butcher of the Grolak, was there, but the predator's grace had failed him. His mandibles twitched with a rhythmic, nervous tremor. His optics were wide and glazed with the beginning of a profound, primal fear. "Varka!" I shouted over the din in the name of the stars. "What is the metric of this chaos?" He did not look at me. His gaze was fixed on the central holoscreen. "Kragos V, our secondary industrial hub. It has been scoured," he rasped, his voice a dry, rattling ghost of its former power. The silence took the system 6 minutes after the first contact. He signaled to a trembling operator, and the screen flickered into a harsh, violent life. We watched the feed in a state of paralyzing horror that drained the very heat from the room. A single ship emerged from the tear of a hyperdrive, a sleek, arrow-shaped blade of dark alloy, painted an arterial, blood red that seemed to drink the light of the Kragos sun. It did not issue a challenge, it did not demand a surrender. It simply began raining a calculated, mathematical hell down upon the planetary defensive platforms. We watched those platforms, the pride of Grolak Chrome, buckle and shatter under the weight of an energy they could not comprehend. The ship did not stop. It moved with a relentless, terrifying momentum, joined by 3 others of the same design, then 6, then a dozen, until they formed a perfect, lethally precise arrowhead of fire. Then came more, hundreds, an entire armada birthed from the vacuum, appearing not as a fleet, but as a force of nature. It was an onslaught of pure, unfiltered erasure. The camera feed flared into a blinding, white-hot death and then went black. The council erupted into a cacophony of blind panic. "Who the frag are they?" screamed the Vree ambassador. "Why have they attacked without provocation? Is this a new aggressor from the void? Can anyone tell us anything about these monsters?" Amidst the screaming, I felt a trail of ice slide down the length of my spine. A small, nagging detail had snagged on my subconscious, a jagged edge of memory. "Play that last section again," I whispered to the technician, my voice a strangled rasp. The final 3 seconds before the flare. The technician, his hands shaking so violently he nearly missed the console, complied. "Stop there. Freeze the frame." The image of the red ship filled the hall. "Spin the image," I commanded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Show us the hull." The image rotated, grainy and static-filled. There was something etched there, white against the blood-red armor. My mind was roaring now, a deafening sound in the back of my skull. "Enlarge that," I said, pointing a trembling finger. The pixels smoothed into clarity. My blood turned to slush. There, in perfect, crisp English characters, were the words New Haven, the name of the very colony Varka had scoured for sport. "They're human," I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips. The shouting fell silent as the room turned to see the image. One delegate shrieked in hysteria. "How? They are soft creatures. They are farmers and chocolate givers. This is a lie." But I remembered the immovable wall of the guard's hand. I remembered the cold steel of Harlan's arm. And I remembered that look in his eye, the look of a wolf that had finally decided to stop pretending it wasn't a wolf. For the next several days, I sat in my chambers, a prisoner of my own fear, watching the tactical overlays flicker like dying candles. I watched the human fleet, an engine of planetary erasure, systematically, coldly, and surgically dismantle the Grolak. It was not a battle. There was no strategic retreat, no heroic last stand. It was a harvest. Other armadas appeared, folding space with a sophisticated tech that our greatest scientists had not even theorized. They surrounded the Grolak Empire like a closing, crushing fist. Varka's imperial fleet, the terror of the quadrant for 300 years, met them in the pride of their power. It was over in 14 minutes. 14 minutes to turn 10,000 warships into a glittering, silent cloud of expanding gas and frozen meat. The humans didn't pause to celebrate. They transmitted no boast. They just kept moving, silent and terrifyingly efficient, until every red icon on my map converged on the Grolak homeworld. There was a single, agonizing heartbeat where I thought they might seek a diplomatic resolution. They did not. They opened fire, a concentrated beam of unimaginable power that bypassed the atmosphere and turned the very foundations of the planet into molten slag. I watched a world die in real time, and I felt nothing but the crushing, suffocating weight of my own past silence. I eventually made my way back to the Great Hall, and as I looked out from my high dais, I felt the profound silence of a tomb. No one moved. No one spoke. We sat there, the leaders of the galaxy, in a state of stunned, collective shock. The humans hadn't just won a war. They had erased an entire era of Grolak history from the ledger of the stars. The only sound in that vast chamber was a thin, pathetic, and rhythmic noise coming from the Grolak delegation. I looked down and saw Varka. The monster who had once loomed so large, the predator who had adjusted his armor with such arrogant grace while mocking the dead, was now nothing more than a broken heap of meat slumped in his seat, sobbing uncontrollably. He trembled, his armor rattling with the force of his terror, as he stared at the screen where his entire empire, his history, his culture, and his very soul, had just been reduced to a cloud of drifting ash. A shadow, vast and unnatural, birthed from the belly of a cold eclipse, bled across the floor of the Great Hall. It extinguished the flickering bioluminescence of the seats with a weight of oppressive darkness that felt like a physical blow. My terminal flared, a frantic, automated scream warning that a human dreadnought of impossible mass was hovering directly over the Capitol spire. But no one looked at their screens. We did not need the data to tell us that death had arrived. We could feel it in the air, a sudden drop in pressure that made the ears ring and the lungs ache for oxygen. There was no frantic dash for the exits. We were the architects of 1,000 systems, and we possessed the grim mathematics to know there was nowhere to hide, no shield in the chrome of the galaxy that could repel the hammer hanging above us. The panic was a quiet, suffocating thing. I saw Glaucus of the Vree clawing at his own throat with trembling fingers, his once moist skin turning the sickly, dry gray of papery ash. Beside him, delegates collapsed into their sleeves, staring upward with glassy eyes, waiting for the ceiling to turn our history into dust. My own hands locked onto the stone dais so tightly the ancient rock groaned. We weren't waiting for a ship to land. We were waiting for the sentence to be carried out. It landed. The vibration hummed through the very bedrock of the planet, a low-frequency growl that rattled the teeth in our skulls. After an agonizing pause that stretched the nerves to the breaking point, the grand, reinforced doors hissed open. In walked a man who seemed to suck the kinetic heat from the room. He had hair the color of iron and eyes like a winter sea viewed from a drowning ship. He wore a Terran military uniform, black, crisp, and devoid of the colorful, pathetic medals of diplomacy. He was not a bridge builder, he was a bridge burner. Behind him trailed 4 guards, encased in powered armor and carrying weapons designed to level city blocks. I forced my voice into the air, trying to salvage a shred of authority from the wreckage of my pride. No arms are permitted in this sacred hall. I stammered, my voice a brittle fracture. I must insist you remove your soldiers. They did not blink. They did not deign to look at me. When the man reached the Grolak delegation, he stopped. Without a word, without a shift in his frozen expression, he drew a sidearm. He shot them all dead, Varka first, then the aides, one after another, the reports of the weapon echoing like thunder in the tomb. No one moved. He holstered the gun with a mechanical click and spoke in a voice of frozen steel. I am Robert Harlan's replacement. The Grolak Empire is extinct. Would anyone else in this room like to join the ledger? The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the heavy thud of my own heart. The man sat in the chair once occupied by Harlan, a chair that now looked far too small for the gravity he radiated, and waited with a terrifying patience for the council to find its breath. I was the first to break the bloody silence, my voice a trembling whisper. You murdered them. You walked into this house of peace and you slaughtered them. The man looked at me, his grey eyes devoid of remorse, as cold as a data leak. Yes. Well, we felt it necessary to act. We were concerned for our long-term security, he replied, his words dripping with a sarcasm so sharp it felt like a blade. But then, it was their own fault, wasn't it? They simply failed to fill in the proper colonial forms. Isn't that right, Ambassador Glaucus? Glaucus, the architect of that very lie, sat frozen, trying to become invisible, his skin now the color of a dead moon. I felt a spark of my old self flicker to life, a desperate need for the rules that had governed my long, hollow life. You cannot do this. This is an affront to everything this council stands for. It is barbaric. He interrupted me, his voice cutting through mine like a guillotine. Yes, about that. That is precisely why I am here. Let me tell you a story, Speaker. When we first realized the stars were full of life, our people divided into 2 camps. The first, led by dreamers like Harlan, wanted to reach out. They wanted to make friends, to share this beautiful, massive universe with fellow sapients. The other camp, the one I lead, believed it was inevitable that we would clash. We believed war was not an option, but a certainty of the breed. Harlan and his poets won the argument. He became our ambassador because we desperately hoped we were wrong. We hoped we could be friends. But you, he gestured to the terrified room, you proved us wrong. You proved us wrong the moment you decided 50,000 of our people were an acceptable sacrifice for your rotting Galactic Council. He paused, drawing a deep, steady breath that seemed to fill the room with a cold weight. So, the human race has divided once more. The first camp argues that you are all predators at heart, fundamentally untrustworthy, and will turn on us in the end. They argue we should not stop with the Grolak, but continue the harvest until every one of you is erased from the star charts. He looked at every face, his gaze lingering on mine. I am in that camp. I am its voice. But the other camp, those who still cling to a shred of the mercy Harlan believed in, argues that while this council is a charnel house, that is no reason for omnicide. They argue we should withdraw, seal our borders, and if any alien ever picks a fight again, we eliminate them with the same efficiency we showed the Grolak. Fortunately for you, the withdraw camp won the argument. For now. Effective immediately, Earth irrevocably withdraws from this hollow council. We remain within our own borders, along with the sterilized territory of the Grolak. If you leave us alone, we leave you alone. But if you give us an excuse, even a micrometric of a reason, we will leave our space and we will hunt you until your very names are forgotten by the void. And let me deliver a personal metric, he said, leaning forward until his shadow seemed to consume the center of the hall, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the heavy, tectonic weight of a planet's death. I shall be watching. I shall be waiting. Every sensor sweep, every border patrol, every whispered thought of expansion toward our space will be monitored as a biological threat. Just give me an excuse. Give me a single, solitary reason to finish what we started. Give me a reason to have your species, your families, your cultures, your very names, join the Grolak Empire in the ash of history. With that final, terrifying benediction, he rose, adjusted the stiff collar of his black uniform with a mechanical, bone-deep precision, and turned his back on the collective power of the galaxy. He walked out as he had entered, followed by the rhythmic, heavy tread of his armored guards, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt as if the air itself had been vacuumed from the room, leaving us all to choke on the void. I watched them leave, my many eyes tracking the rhythmic, heavy, and metallic tread of their boots until the grand doors hissed shut with a sound like a final breath escaping a punctured lung. In the hollow and suffocating silence that followed, I felt the physical weight of my ceremonial robes, garments that had once been symbols of prestige and ancient wisdom, but were now merely heavy, useless, and gaudy fabric draped over a coward's frame. I knew then, with a clarity that pierced my very soul, that I could no longer sit upon that high dais. I had stood by while the fires of New Haven burned. I had been bound by the very chains of bureaucracy that the humans now mocked with such lethal, kinetic efficiency. I had played my part in this galactic tragedy, a silent witness, a passive observer to the birth of a nightmare. Within the hour, I submitted my formal resignation. I could not, and would not, lead a council that had bartered its immortal soul for trade tariffs and mineral rights, only to find itself shivering at the mercy of the monsters it had helped to forge. I retired to a modest, lonely habitat on the far edge of the city, where the lights of the Great Hall are nothing more than a faint, mocking glow on the distant horizon. I find the solace of the dark strangely comforting, though every time the shadow of a ship passes overhead, I find myself looking up into the black, wondering with a cold dread if this is the excuse they've been waiting for. Over the slow, agonizing, and quiet years of my retirement, I watched as the humans faded from the political landscape, receding from the light of diplomacy and into the terrifying realm of dark myth. I saw the star charts being redrawn by trembling hands, large, jagged swathes of the galaxy simply labeled as forbidden zones, voids where no council ship dared to venture, where no explorer dared to tread. I heard the whispered stories told to frightened hatchlings in the deep of the night, tales of the steel spirits, the vengeful ghosts of a kinder race who would descend from the stars to erase any world that dared to step out of line. I watched as the very memory of the humans I had once known, the passionate artists, the generous chocolate givers, the bridge-building friends, was systematically overwritten by the terrifying, blood-red legend of the predators they had become. Occasionally, some young, arrogant pilot, fueled by bravado and ignorance, would boast of flying into their territory to find the truth behind the myth. I would simply watch their ships depart into the dark, knowing with a hollow, absolute certainty that I would never see their meat return. As the long cycles went on, I fell into the ritualistic habit of visiting a quiet, shadowed bar once a week, a place where the past felt closer than the present, lit by the flickering neon of a dying neighborhood. I grew to know the weary barman and the regular, broken clientele. One night, as I sat in my usual corner, I listened to a group of young, boisterous aliens who were not regulars. They were debating with a loud, foolish confidence what humans actually look like, asking if they possessed horns of bone, if they were made of living fire, or if they were giants of iron. I gave the barman a knowing, tired look. He was old enough to remember the smell of earth coffee. He slowly shook his head and offered a sad, thin smile. The speculation grew more and more fanciful, more ridiculous. One of the youths saw my interaction and called out across the room, "Hey, old man. You look like you've seen the end of the world. What do you think? What are they really?" I swallowed the last of my bitter drink and felt the weight of my years in my joints. I stood up, my frame creaking. "I have actually seen one," I said, and the room went still. The crowd scoffed, thinking me a senile storyteller. My eyes went distant then, traveling back through the decades to the last time I stood before my once friend Robert Harland and watched him transform into a god of war. I held up my hand, about a foot from the youth's face. I stood this close. I looked into their eyes. Those dark, cold, and bottomless eyes. Eyes that were darker and colder than the deepest reaches of space itself. The crowd hushed, the mockery dying in their throats. One asked in a trembling whisper, "What did you see there?" I turned to them and delivered my final truth. Something you had better wish, pray, and beg the stars that you never see. Because if you look into those eyes, you will never be the same again. Because no matter what you think you know, no matter what stories you tell yourselves to sleep at night, humans are far more terrifying than you could possibly imagine. With that, I left the now quiet bar and walked out into the cold, silent night.